We are live.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Mihir, and on behalf of Voyages into the Past, Otit Probaho, good evening to all our listeners and our esteemed guest, Professor Sanjeev Jain, for today's lecture titled Wounded Souls 75 Years After India's Partition. The idea for this lecture was born out of discussions that arose at Voyages to organize an event commemorating World Mental Health Day, which is celebrated on the 10th of October. In the words of the World Federation of Mental Health, World Mental Health Day was observed for the first time on 10th October 1992. The day, officially commemorated every year on October 10th, aims to raise awareness in the global community about the critical mental health agendas with a unifying voice through collaboration with various partners to take action and create lasting change. We at Voyages felt that there was no better way to honor the same than to explore what was for India possibly its single most traumatic event and its impact in the contemporary world. In this, there are few of greater stature than Professor Sanjeev Jain, alongside Dr. Alok Sarin, spearheaded work on a compendium of research into the impact of the partition through the lenses of psychiatry and medicine, titled The Psychological Impact of the Partition in India. In a quote from the first chapter of the same, was the act of partition mindful of the emotional trauma not only to those who were directly involved, but also the transgenerational effects of such an event? For a person with mental illness or insanity, does insanity divest the individual of personal, collective, and national identity? Did the partition unleash an insanity which persists in day to day life, attitude, and ideology? Do political trauma and social distancing, whether by fascism in Germany or by colonialism and racism or other forms of social oppression, contribute to psychological symptoms? I do not intend to editorialize here, but the book is positively wonderful and a very worthwhile read. About Professor Sanjeev Jain. He is a clinician and a teacher and researches the genetic correlates of psychiatric and neurological disease. He studied medicine at the Delhi University, Maulana Azad Medical College, and did his postgraduate studies at the National Institute for Mental Health and Neurological Sciences. The neurosciences. Uh, he has been a Commonwealth Fellow at Cambridge, United Kingdom, and the co-director of NIH Fogarty Training and Mentorship Program. He has provided the lead for and participated in several population and cohort studies and also provided genetic testing for several neurodegenerative disorders as well as counseling services for these families. This work includes genetics of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, Alzheimer's disease, and Huntington's disease, as well as addiction and OCD. Over the past few years, discussions and collaboration with other colleagues at NIMHANS, the NCBS, and INSTEM have extended the research from the clinic to the bench using both clinical assessments, including MRI, EEGs, and etc., as well as tools of cellular and molecular biology, including WES, iPSC, and neuronal cell lines from individuals diagnosed with psychiatric illnesses and their affected and unaffected relatives. He has been a member of the committee for drafting the mental health policy document for India and is also an adjunct faculty at the National Center for Biological Sciences, TIFR, Bangalore. His other interests include the history of mental health services in India from the colonial to the contemporary period. This work has helped understand the interface between science and medicine and social responses to mental illness in India. The work has been supported by various agencies in India, DBT, ICMR, DST, and the CISR, as also the Wellcome Trust, NIH Fogarty, and the MRC ICMR. With that, Professor, it's over to you.
Thank you, Meher, for a very fulsome introduction. But today we are going to talk just about the nuts and bolts of partition. So, can I have the next slide? Now, psychiatry, as we know, is a very complex issue in a sense that we think of a person in a maze of social relationships, a jumble of wires in the brain, a kind of pill popping, some chemical goes wrong, and etc., etc. And of course, it has a political dimension, as you can see in the helmet worn by a US soldier in Iraq. So, can I have the next slide? So, psychiatry is is a very odd discipline, and what we try to understand is why do people go mad and how can we help? In that essence, because of our training and the way medicine is these days, it is basically a branch of medicine, and medicine is supposed to be dependent on the principles of science. And in that sense, modern medicine arises out of the renaissance of the middle of the last millennium, when people like Vesalius, Harvey, Hooke, Newton, Da Vinci, etc., secularized the body. What were mysterious illnesses and humors and blah, blah, blah became simply circuits and organs and secretions and connections. And it immediately became obvious that despite the disparity of shapes and forms of not just the human species, but the entire living species, all bodies were essentially the same. And this created the framework for a universality of medical care, and therefore had a huge impact on what we call the secularization of human existence. Because the laws of physics to the laws of biology, life, consciousness, the universe, everything could be explained on fairly straightforward universal principles, which did not require any metaphysical or religious explanation. And this commonality therefore made science possible. And the differences between the various things that we see on Earth makes science necessary, because only then do you actually understand what the differences are. So psychiatry therefore lies at this cusp of of understanding these commonalities and the differences. Can I have the next slide? And therefore, the secularization of human existence is therefore essential, and interventions can be developed to manage these. Of course, the biggest problem with psychiatry itself is, does the mind have matter and does it matter? Can the functioning of what we call the mind be reduced to chemicals and circuits in the brain? Is it emerge from the brain? Is it a product of the brain? Does the mind produce the brain, or does the brain produce the mind? All these are fundamental issues, and therefore psychiatry remains the most abstract and the most radical branch of medicine, because it has no specific organ. The mind cannot be reduced to the brain. The brain alone, devoid of its memories, perceptions, impressions of the past through books and what we call culture, cannot create a mind. And therefore it's a completely radical branch of medicine. And it always raises the question, in physical medicine we have realized that all bodies are the same. Now we need to understand, are all minds the same? And that is really the challenge of psychiatry. Can I have the next slide? Now, before, and I'll go rapidly through this, so because before the modern era, almost all the notions of madness, whether it's Greco-Roman or Indian or Islamic, had uh, had recognized the symptoms of madness, had recognized symptoms like epilepsy, anxiety, fearfulness, the nature of the soul, the causes such as love, books, substance abuse, addictions, dementias, forgetfulness. All the essential clinical aspects of psychiatry have been known for thousands of years. And madness has always been a part of human society, and exchange of ideas and techniques between societies and culture has allowed a kind of uniform, universal understanding of what a madman or what madness is and what one could do. Can I have the next slide? And this basically arises from the fact that the so called soul, or the psyche as we call it now, was supposed to be a divine origin, that the body was made of clay and God or some divine being inserted a soul into it. And the nature of the relationship between the soul and the physical world lay at the root of psychiatry. And almost all these, I'm just giving some random examples between Hinduism, Buddhism, the Christianity, Islam, and all the various reform movements, whether it's Sikhism or the Bhakti movements, all of them focused on this aspect of the soul. Right? Can I have the next slide? Obviously, being faith systems, these were not open for experimental evaluation, and they were closed systems. In the modern world, of course, you have signs of madness everywhere, from King George III to Robert Clive of Plassey, close to Calcutta, and all the other luminaries you see on this, from Britney Spears to Robin Williams to Günter Grass to Samuel Beckett to Vivian Leigh to Rajput. So kings, politicians, scientists, authors, actors, all of us have a propensity of growing mad. And as Shakespeare pointed out, great weights are showed to madness near allied, and thin partitions divide. So the partition between madness and sanity is as much a partition as it is of any other kind. Can I have the next slide? Now, where does that leave us? Now, the assumption has always been that mad people lose reason and they become withdrawn into themselves. This is a classic example of exactly the opposite. Now, you can read the result, you can read the history carefully, because this man who is admitted to a hospital in Ranchi has, within a few weeks, dreams or delusions involving Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, interwoven with the politics of the partition that he has just witnessed. So that from Kali he changes his language from Bengali to Hindi. Then he becomes more and more upset about this transgression, and then becomes English. And then he has obscene ideas about the Virgin Mary. So this kind of incorporation of the problems the society around is facing into the psychological life of the mentally ill is something that we see all the time. There's another patient in the same Ranchi asylum who goes through the entire political belief of being an admirer of Subhash Chandra, then the communist, and then then Ambedkarite, and then guilt at the sense of assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. So the facts of the partition were reflected in the psychological space of the mentally ill. Now, didn't the so-called normal people wonder about the lives of the mentally ill? Can we go to the next one? So our interest basically started with the celebration a few years ago of, for some reason, the slides have got damaged. Anyway, um, that the on the centenary of Manto's birth, we came across this little snippet in the personal diaries of Lord Mountbatten, saying that the institutions like the Punjab Mental Hospital will not be partitioned. There was popular fear, and the statesman in Calcutta ran an editorial saying that even the mentally ill are to be partitioned. Mountbatten issued a press note and assured people that this will not happen. But as is typical with bureaucracy, the devil is in the detail. It's immediately and some years. And this is exactly what happened. Over the next few years, can I have the next slide? Oh, sorry, that it was there. So anyway, what happened was, of course, the partition of India. And as Lieutenant General Hamid pointed out, the British are a very just people. They left India in as many pieces as they found it. Can I have the next slide? Now, so what is a prelude to all this? Now, by the early 1940s, there had been many books had started appearing. One was a kind of a virulent kind of book called Nationalism and Conflict in India, written in 1943, with a foreword by no less than Jinnah, who posited that the Hindus and Muslims were sufficiently different to qualify them as separate species of human beings, and having them live together was like putting lions and tigers together in the same cage. They admired the German response to the Jewish question and repeatedly emphasized that there was no shared experience of culture or life in India, therefore partition was the only option. Vakil, on the other side, from Bombay, also reflected that that Hindus and Muslims enter different ideological and cultural worlds, read different newspapers, and think different thoughts. And there's a pervasive provincialism which needed to be replaced by a sense of common destiny. And he warned against the partitioning of India. Can I have the next slide? Into the middle of all this come the doctors. So at this point in time, the British know that they're going to leave India. The Second World War is going on, and the health reforms have to be constructed for the independent India. And a very luminary board of advisors, experts from the US, Australia, Oxford, and from the Public Health Service of USA, combined to advise India on how this is to be done. Because provision of healthcare was going to be an essential and basic function of the state post Second World War, and universal healthcare would leaven the bread and help India rise as it became independent. They were assured by the health workers in Lahore that there was no communal thinking at all in the city, as the midwives and the workers were never questioned about their religion. They urged a national health service. They visit Sigur next to Calcutta, where a people's clinic, which is entirely community run, has been running for very successfully. And they find this social kind of healthcare very important. They detect a wariness about adopting Western ideas. And of course, things happen. The Pore Committee says that everybody should get healthcare and without any humiliation. Can I have the next slide? At the same time, Beni Prasad, who is a professor at the Allahabad University, feels that social psychotherapy is essential for India. There's a little book called The Hindu Muslim Question, written sometime in 1943. He feels that there is a need for qualities to be brought consciously into play against older manifestations that are suited to an environmental of absolutist government. And to speak of Hindus and Muslims as separate civilizations is to equate, quite correctly, the whole of civilization with religious creed and result in magnification of non essentials. To paraphrase and Baudelaire Freud, the tyranny of small differences rather than the narcissism of small differences will make all this it's just small differences which are being blown out of proportion and resulting in all this acrimonious kind of problems. If carried on, of course, it will not escape the corollaries of exchange in population and drive towards complete domination. And a strong government versus self-government, as more will prefer security over liberty, and this would be tragic because it was hoped that India would be able to contribute a new humanism for the 20th century and beyond, because it was the world's largest democracy coming into existence. Owen Berkeley Hill, the psychiatrist at Ranchi, pointed out, can I see the bottom of the slide, please? Yeah, that when every effort to reduce a perennial feud between Hindus and Muslims to dispel such feelings leads to nothing, our supposition is that it is mainly derived from the unconscious and becomes a certainty. Can I have the next slide? So, why is all this important? The gradual development of medical care by the 30s and 40s assumed a certain universal humanism and a certain non-sectarian application of healthcare. This was a process that had been going on for more than 150 years, ever since the first medical college was opened in Calcutta in 1835. And when Madhusudan Gupta's first dissection was celebrated by a 31 gun salute as being the end of orthodoxy in India. If Hindu Brahmin doctors can touch a dead body and cut open a dead body, that was the end of orthodox science, and the new science and a new age was upon us. Secular hospitals, or the hospitals that were established, were almost invariably devoid of any caste-based distinctions, and within 30 or 40 years, the so-called government hospitals became by far the preferred mode of treatment, especially for the poor and the disadvantaged. So medical care, by 100 years later, had been made a part of civic society, which was avowedly non-sectarian and universal. However, in 1947, these hospitals themselves were targeted, and there was a lack of a medical and psychological response to the trauma of the partition, and the staff therefore suffered. And what we try to understand is through reading of these diaries and notes as to what happened. Okay, can I have the next slide? Now, what is it that the records show? The people who are observing all this happening, the bureaucrats and the politicians, use a lot of psychological terms. Now, this is important not just for the nitpicking detail, but also to understand that the people so-called in charge were aware of the psychological roots and the psychological issues that were being played out. They call it the hysterical urge to Muslims to serve in the West and Hindus and Sikhs to serve in the East. The average educated Indian attempts to rationalize the behavior of his countrymen. The mood of the government calls for a sedative rather than shock treatment. Please remember, shock treatments had been invented only in 1939-40. And Gandhi, as did many others, referred to this as a sign of madness and issues a formal plea for sanity and was assassinated 10 days later. The doctors who are there describe lines of people with cholera and illness having to inoculate hundreds of people, terrible toll on physical and mental health, hastily drug graves, gibbering women who Swaran, one of the workers, leads away. The doctors all run away from Delhi to Lahore and from Lahore to Delhi. The staff are shot and killed in Amritsar. People are killed in the railway stations in Delhi and Lahore. A doctor practicing in Paharganj is shot in the middle of his clinic. And patients in wards in northwest Delhi are killed inside the wards based on identity. And this causes particular uh, heartburn to Nehru, who says this is really the worst possible thing that can happen to a country, that people are being killed in hospital beds. Accounts of injury and deaths were formally reported for a while, but soon stopped. And no, in between this, there is a very interesting document, which is a post-mortem report in Calcutta, which was 10 years before that, who notes that when they are doing the post-mortems of injuries in Calcutta mortuaries, most of the wounds are on the back, suggesting that whoever the perpetrator was at least had the decency to not look the person in the eye when they were killing them. It was this decency which disappeared, and which led to all, which is what we want to, which we were trying to understand. Unlike the response to the Holocaust in Europe, when people like Hannah Arendt, Bruno Levy, Viktor Frankl, Erich Fromm wrote pages and books on what it meant to be a part of that whole process of in Europe, and why it should never happen again. That kind of thing never happened in India. Of course, the total number of psychiatrists in India was less than 50, so perhaps there was a extremely inadequate numbers. Can I have the next slide? In between this, there is a committee in Calcutta being organized to understand this, the psychological responses. And this meeting is held on the 12th of August in 1947 in Calcutta, uh, to say that we need to understand the present conflicts and those in prospect, because we have to save the world from the possibility of human and cultural destruction. Now, this is a very grandiose aim, and to have a meeting in Calcutta with this as the agenda is quite startling. It is being organized by the Friends Ambulance, which is a group of Quaker Christians who are very close to Gandhi. Gandhi used to stay in the Quaker Christian churches in London, and they had been active in India for a very long time. For example, Andrews was a Quaker, and many of the others were. So, but this meeting brings together psychologists, and it says that the nature of human evil lies in the Christian notion of guilt. It has a religious root, and N.S. Shastri, who is a professor at the Indian Institute of Science, called an unresolved Oedipus complex, inferiority complex, unconscious fear of the other. They warn that too much romanticism of the goodness of human beings needs to be avoided, and the victims needed succor, of course, but it was the moral abyss in the soul of the perpetrator that would take generations to heal. Because here they note that the wounds have been on the chest and in the front, and the cutting off of breasts and the mutilation of bodies, and this is a face-to-face thing. And the moral abyss in the soul of the perpetrator of this violence would take generations to heal. Those who were wounded, the doctors would patch them up and get on with life. But the perpetrator is the one that would be seriously a worrying thing for decades to come. Of course, there were thousands of victims. No one was ever found guilty. There was a lack of responsibility, guilt, and remorse. Can I have the next slide? Unlike, yeah. So what did this give rise to? Now, the first ever inquiry made by the UNESCO WHO was to look at the psychological impact of this. So, Gardner Murphy, who was a psychologist in the US, was charged with looking at the psychological impact of the partition of India. And he obviously correctly pointed out that it was first created in the minds of men. The physical partition happened only later. So, what was this fractured identity? The Hindus and Muslims, he felt, had grown apart socially in the past 2 decades. It had been a manufactured distancing because Otherwise, the indigenous roots of strength, faith, and community uh, were quite strong. They would need to be protected and nurtured, especially in the name of development. Literacy would increase, but the deeper literacy of understanding is likely to be destroyed. Now, this observation by Gardner Murphy that the distancing had been created in 20 years then gave rise to other ideas, which I'll be talking about later. But however, at the point of independence, the defining of India as a pluralistic, diverse, but unified society became a statement of faith. And this assertion produced a blind spot as the debates around the events of partition were not as extensive as as because we try to brush under the carpet all the psychological impact and the violence. But the breakdown of social cohesion and inclusive politics has cast a long shadow on the emergence of psychological commons or the universal humanism which was expected. And Western ideas about the nature of man were now politically seen to be false, ineffectual, and Indian values were reaffirmed. And this, in turn, reflected that individuals were redefined as part of community and clan networks, and not. Can I move the slide up a little bit? And rather than autonomous persons, exactly as the colonial attitudes had been, that human beings, Indians, were either part of the martial races or this race or that race or this caste or the other. And in independent India, we continued to view ourselves with the same colonial gaze. Can I have the next slide? Into all these steps, Dr. D. Satyanand. Now, D. Satyanand is a very interesting person because he is a psychiatrist in Punjab and therefore a possible eyewitness. He is trained purely in India from the Amritsar Medical School. He has a brief stint of training in Ranchi about psychiatry, where he comes in contact with Owen Berkeley Hill, who is a British psychiatrist and self taught psychoanalyst. And he is. Uh, his parents have converted from Hinduism and Islam to psychiatry, to Christianity, and he's a Christian by faith, but a pan-Indian by his disposition. Because as you can see, he quotes from Iqbal to Shankara to Radhakrishnan to Nietzsche and Hegel and Russell. So he is then appointed as the first professor of psychiatry at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi. And as a part of that, he feels that we have to design a new man for India. And the reason he says that is that, as you can see, can you just move it up slightly? The prevailing socio-economic state of the country is caused by defective and immature community ego development, and the low state of political, social, and economic integration causes and maintains defective and immature community ego. And why is that happening? Because the feeling of belongingness, which is the most essential for mental health, is being given short shrift. The book that is mentioned on top is a very interesting account of psychoanalysis of a young woman who wants to opt out of a middle class life and join the freedom movement. And it shows a particular kind of understanding of psychological processes in pre-independence India. Can we go to the next one? So obviously, as I just mentioned, the partition of madness, the process of dividing minds over the preceding 20 to 30 years was used to justify a physical separation, as Gardner Murphy pointed out in 1951 in his Minds of Men. Now, this was something that plays up again and again. For example, Kekmanovic, a psychiatrist from Yugoslavia, pointed out used this a specific example because Karadzic and Milosevic were both psychologists, psychiatrists. They used the language of psychiatry. They identified the Croats as having defective ego strengths, how the Serbs' ego strength were incompatible with Croats, how the very notion of motherland as being positioned in Serb understanding did not allow for the faulty ego structures or the id-driven ego structures of the Croats, who were basically caught up with id impulses of sex and violence. And this kind of psychological jargon was used to justify the partition of Yugoslavia 50 years later. And then, of course, the people otherwise have been talking about the Balkanization of India and the Pakistanization of Africa. This has its roots way back to Freud because Freud felt that psychological understanding of human beings stopped outside of the German Empire. He was very, very reluctant to apply psychoanalysis to Yugoslavia or to the Slavic countries because he felt these societies were too immature to really understand psychological uh, issues. And that is what reflected also in his not very warm appreciation of Bose. But however, this kind of psychological processes, self awareness, ultimately ends up in identity politics, as you can see in Yugoslavia going on even now, and in India as well. And of course, it ends up in producing a civilized South Asian past, which, though distance, is regarded as superior to the current chaos, which is peopled by unruly mobs, which are incapable of mature reflection, which are persistently childish and are not conscious human beings in the psychological sense. Can we go to the next one? There were other. Dr. Moshimi Basu wrote a chapter on comparing this to ethno-nationalism in Yugoslavia, the genocide in Darfur, the immigration debates in Europe, and of course the various regionalisms and partitions that we have continued to put on ourselves even after independence, and how the difference in ideas rapidly translates into an idea of difference, so that there is no space for pluralistic existence anymore, and it is always a question of drawing lines. And as an analysis of the short stories or the literary output, this time mainly in Hindi and Punjabi and Urdu, by Saint and Nandrajog, pointed out that there was a persistent failure at the level of the imagination, and how alienation and the permanence of exile became codified, something that you find all the way down to the modern English writers. For example, Salman Rushdie, the permanence of exile is basically what he's talking about, and the complete rootlessness of being removed from all familiar points of reference, which obviously has huge impact on the psychological state. Can I have the next slide? Aisha Kidwai pointed out that there was this whole issue at the partition that women who had been kidnapped and raped and impregnated were had in many cases, but all women had to be exchanged. But those who had been impregnated or were carrying children had to be forcefully aborted, or they had to leave the child in the other place. Now, this obviously led to a whole lot of emotional trauma on the women who by now had become mothers, had become wives, and therefore this repatriation was without any attention to all that. It was just as if they were a piece of property. So this obviously brought into question the notion of citizenship, the identity that at the time of independence, and how much autonomy were women being allowed in all this affair. And of course, many of the women being rescued were, inverted commas, not in a normal state of mind. This For this, the extensive records of the Mridula Sarabhai and the Abducted Persons Act and the Anis Vidwai's account of Freedom's Shade were the major sources. But interestingly, we did find that, for example, there's a hospital in Delhi, B.L. Kapoor Hospital, which was established at a time when abortions were not even medically considered as a legitimate medical procedure, specifically to do abortions for this kind of repatriation. So that even if the women were coming back, they should not be carrying the seed or the stain of the other. So this kind of, and for that, even the rules of medicine were bent, and abortion clinics were set up in Delhi. Sukeshi Kamra, who lives and works in Scandinavia, pointed out that in contemporary Indian discourse, and this is quite evident, that, for example, we are celebrating 75 years of independence from the British because we want to get over the negative affective state of colonial subjugation, which you must remember technically lasted only 75 years, from 1857 to 1947, or 90 years, less than 100 years, definitely. But the violence of the partition is met with silence. So the memory of the colonial subjugation is somehow given a mnemonic and you know value of deified value of oppression that we must get over. But the operations that we did to ourselves, which is the partition, is not mentioned. And in the absence of working through this past, are we trapped into a future of unending partitions, which is the real concern. Can I have the next slide? Now, now before we go into this, now we must remember that the 20s and 30s, or between the two world wars, were dramatic for psychiatry as a whole. Uh, everything new that we use in psychiatry was invented: electroconvulsive therapy, etc., etc. What was interesting is that in the city of Calcutta, they started using extracts of raw Wolfia sarpagandha by Bose and Sen, who were a medical doctor and Ayurvedic physician. And the Bengal chemicals started selling this as the first ever drug used to treat psychiatric disorders way back in 1930. And this was for sale. This is a page from the Indian Journal of Psychiatry in 1949. This was available till 1949. Bengal chemicals still exist, but at that point of time, it was a kind of a nationalistic uh, industrial enterprise to establish that Indians could manufacture chemicals as well as anybody else in the world. The chemistry of Ralphin had to be worked out, and but all the scientists who were working on it, basically a team led by Salimun Zaman Siddiqui in Delhi and Aligarh, was sent off to Pakistan as some kind of uh, help Pakistan gain its scientific advantage. He was a member of the Royal Society and invented the election ink and was had done the chemistry of raw wolfia. But because of this whole scientific enterprise of what to do with psychiatry was destroyed, and we lost the race. The new drugs were invented in 1955 and got 4 Nobel Prizes, and all the initial work done in Bengal, Delhi, and Aligarh was simply waste. At that point of time, the idea that these would perennial borders was not very clear. As you can see in this advertisement, medical practitioners of India and Pakistan who are interested in mental service in India and Pakistan are invited to join the Indian Psychiatric Society. Now, this never occurred in the next few years, and scientific and professional associations were divided along regional political lines, which did not allow a sharing of knowledge and experience about mental health care. Now, to go back to Mountbatten, as was pointed out, our interest started with Alok Sareen, with Alok Sareen and myself, looking through the archives of the mental hospitals, and turns out that 800 of the 800 patients in the Lahore Mental Hospital, around 450 were sent to India. What happened to the others, we don't know. People commented that there was an unnatural death rate because of cholera. What was hinted is that they were killed or they somehow died. We transferred from India a group of 400 to 500 mentally ill people from hospitals as far apart as Agra, Ranchi, and Nagpur, and even Tezpur. Now, Tezpur is a particularly funny example because patients from Tezpur were being transferred because Assam was partitioned also, and they were partitioned to go into Bangladesh, but Bangladesh or East Pakistan. But East Pakistan mental hospitals were now in Ranchi, and so East Pakistan had no mental hospital at all. But that did not concern the powers that be, which ruled India, and patients were being transferred even without ensuring whether there were care facilities on the other side, which made the patients who were coming into Punjab live in tents in Amritsar and start the so-called community psychiatry movement. And some of them were sent all the way to Ranchi because that was the only hospital in India which was directly under imperial control and therefore under control of Delhi. The hospitals of Agra and other hospitals in India refused to accept these partitioned refugees. So in many ways, this this had an impact even on the care of the mentally ill. So can I go to the next slide? And I'll be finishing in about 2 slides more. So, as was pointed out in the beginning, was the act of partition mindful of the emotional trauma or the generational effect? Does insanity divest people of their identity? Does it persist? And can access to medical care, which derives its roots from the progressive movements of the previous half a millennium, be compromised by political events? And let's go to the next slide. Now, as I pointed out earlier, education and services of the cosmopolitan kind were introduced under the British, but access and participation in these was very, very restricted. The British never invested in healthcare, so the lifespan of Indians continued to be stuck at 30 to 35 years through the 100 years of direct British rule, whereas their own lifespan doubled. The lifespan in London and Bombay was different by 15 years in 1871, but differed by 45 years in 1941. Also, doctors and medical services were often seen as collaborators of the Raj. The social and political underpinnings of healthcare were never explored in India. And post-independence within British Empire healthcare had very different trajectories. Australia, New Zealand, Canada versus India, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. So the non-white countries were left with very little technical manpower or even the intellectual substrate to develop a universal healthcare system. After independence, we got preoccupied with infection, somatic disease, and urged to acquire modernity. For example, cardiac bypasses, stents, and MRIs and CT scans were well accepted. But for psychological interventions, we are very, very concerned that these are Western and therefore inapplicable to India, unlike the machines that we love to buy. Can I go to the next one? What are the ripples to the present? The lack of responsibility, guilt, and remorse is perpetuated by stereotypes that are ceaselessly reinforced and the notion that they deserved it, whichever party did the violence and whoever was on the receiving end, and that they deserved no better. But that day is very much realpolitik. And the civilized South Asian past, of course, is in the past. But there's a neglect of the psychological space in the South Asian population. So people, even in medical histories, as we teach students, patient comes from a Hindu person of this. So we want to put the person into what we expect a Hindu should feel like or a Muslim should feel like. It is not the individual. And if you are suspicious of the native mind, then the natives' minds themselves become suspicious. And there is a preoccupation with self-determination of peoples, but a scant regard for the self-determination of the individual. Now, this is a very obvious problem with psychiatry, that modern-day psychiatry, like modern-day medicine, deals with the individual body and the individual mind. It does not bother too much with peoples in general. And the idea of mental health, at least in the so-called Western textbooks, is that the right to self-determination of the individual is much higher than the self-determination of peoples, something that we often forget. That the idea of independence of the individual is higher than the sense of independence of a country. Independence of a country is of no use if the individual cannot be independent. But in many parts of the world, increasingly, and definitely in so-called LMIC countries, especially in our region, the nation's independence takes higher priority, as Beni Prasad Agarwal had predicted, than the independence and the self-determination of the individual. The point psychiatry makes is that if you do not allow individual to be self-determined, then mental health will be lost or will be compromised. But is that an ideal of mental health itself is something that that is being questioned more and more as people try to think that conformity should be the ideal of mental health and not independence. Can I have the next slide? So this interiority question is very, very important, because this non-recognition of the psychological space of patients has not allowed us to understand what the issues are For example, there's hardly any teaching in psychiatry, in Indian psychiatric textbooks, what happens when people experience extreme poverty, deprivation, internal migrations, communal violence, caste oppressions, or various small pinpricks that reduce their sense of oneness and wholeness with the world at large. Uh, as you can read in the newspapers, somebody gets lynched for falling in love across a religious or a caste barrier. Witchcraft provides. So the demonic others and are still being created and persist in our society. So that for psychiatry itself, there is an urgent need to develop a socio-politically relevant discourse to address contemporary tensions of society and ensure social progress. Otherwise, like Thomas Hobbes pointed out many centuries ago, we'll end up having very nasty, brutish, and short psychological spaces and smaller identities and even smaller states. And I have the next slide. No, we have to do it ourselves because otherwise, for the West, we are just a subject of cartoons because this is what they think of us. Because we will continue to be either obdurately oppositional or the cover of Time magazine in 1947. This is what we end up as because unless we pay attention to our own psychological spaces of our citizens, of our individuals, outside so called sectarian labels that we choose to put on them, this will not be a successful enterprise. And the ripples of the partition will go on forever and forever. I think that's the last of it. And next is just a thank you slide. And this is the book which reflects all this. And can I have the next? But the work itself is helped along a lot. Last slide, please. There's just if there is one. There isn't? Right. But the work was funded by the Wellcome Trust. I was helped, along with Alok and myself, were all these people, and two students, Dr. Pradipta Roy from Calcutta, who did his MBBS from Calcutta, but did a PhD in the history of science, and Sara Ghani, who did a psychology from Bangalore and is now a faculty in the Christ College. So thank you very much for your attention. Apologies for the blips in the beginning, and yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor. It was an absolutely wonderful lecture. If there are any questions or comments, please do drop them in the chat box. We shall share them with Professor Sanjeev Jain. Right, I think we can start. Shampurna Chaudhary has written, it shows some light on the Pakistanization of Africa.
Yeah. So this is an opinion which surfaced about a decade and a half ago when the Sudan crisis happened, and of course after the Darfur crisis happened. Now, as you know, the landmass of Africa was divided up post Second World War on dividing the remnants of the German, French, and British empires, and it did not pay any attention to realities on the ground of ethnic or community links. And over the last 40, 50 years, religious movements, for example, between South Sudan and the others, have been based on religion. Within Nigeria, they have been based on religion. Between Ethiopia and within the Ethiopian Christians and the other regions, it's based on religion. And it is not the tribal structures. So the Pakistanization of Africa was actually a phrase made by politicians in the Sudan and in Nigeria who were objecting to using religion as a defining force for defining nationality and dividing the countries of Africa even further, because they would still like to assume that the civic life of modernity, which Africa has is embarking on will be set back if they allow religious divisions to supervene into their sense of identity and going forward. So they feel that Pakistanization or this insistence of religious divisions, for example, as happens in Kenya and Uganda also. So all these more affluent countries within Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and to some extent Sudan and Ethiopia, have objected to this kind of religious uh, ideologies being allowed to permeate or continue in modern day Africa.
All right. The next question is from Shalini Bhattacharya. Um, so thank you for the lecture. My question is, what spaces would you nominate as potential spaces for discourse that are so very much needed?
Well, everywhere and anywhere, basically. Sorry, I've got a very bad, a very close friend of mine in Calcutta died, and tomorrow is his death ceremony. So, anyway, um, see, our experience is that of a psychiatrist, and we would like this to start in psychiatry itself. That we pay more attention to. I'll give you small vignettes. So, for example, an Anganwadi worker comes because she's depressed, because she's been transferred to a village some distance away, because her caste now matches the caste of that village. And because the government wants to be seen as caste affirmative, it is doing this. What they don't realize is that she has worked in this village for 15 years and nobody has ever objected to her caste identity. And for her to be made conscious of her caste identity, therefore, and to think that her life would be governed by this, to her seemed more oppressive than anything else. You know, last 2 or 3 years, we've had lots of people, not lots of people, at least me alone, and please remember there are 40 psychiatrists, but about 6 people I saw in the last 1 year who were depressed because romantic relationships had to be discontinued because of caste or religious differences. Now, this is not something that came to our attention earlier because people would either not enter or just carry on regardless. There was not this social fear that if we go ahead with this, we are likely to be severely ostracized or even beaten up. So that fear has now started percolating down to the clinic because people's sense of freedom and autonomy can get severely curtailed by self censorship, by adhering to a very rigid set of rules which they think others expect them to do. Now that can lead to a very stultified sense of personal destiny and outcomes. On the other hand, when people become actually ill, when people have severe mental illness, when people have are on the street, many of the non-governmental organizations or NGOs work on semi-religious lines. So to find places for shelter or for care for people who are chronically ill, you specifically have to keep their religious backgrounds in mind, which is very bizarre in 21st century India, because we have not built a secular space or secular spaces to look after the ill. We do it for heart operations, we do it for fractures, but we don't seem to be doing it for mental health. So, what are these issues that we talk about? And of course, the impact, the actual impact. You know, I was talking to somebody a couple of days ago about this lady with depression following some language riot in Karnataka, uh, Tamil language riots, Kaveri riot, which converted itself to a language riot. And this lady's son had been killed, who was a teenager. And he said he had never moved out of the slum that we live in. I mean, he had never even crossed the border into Tamil Nadu. He was born here, brought up here. On what basis was he seen as an outsider and killed? So these kinds of things really question the very notion of what a free thinking citizen of India should be able to feel, what kind of psychological space should they occupy to live. As Tagore says, where the head is held high and the mind is without fear. Now, if the head cannot be held high and the mind cannot be without fear, then what kind of psychological space are we really talking about? And that is a concern, and that is the continuing ripple of the partition, because we continue to see ourselves in sectarian terms, and those can be in India made as fine as a wisp of hair. So, uh, so everybody is an outsider, everybody is the other, and that defies any sense of shared existence, and therefore defies any sense of a conscious, confident person.
Okay. The next question is from Preetha Mujumdar, and it's a relatively long one. Sir, according to you, to what extent can the general findings from other studies of mass violence or even genocide, such as the Holocaust, since that
Right.
is where one of the largest body of work studying the
Sure.
psychology exists, be applied to the partition? And what could
Yeah.
be certain unique aspects of the psychological effects of the partition?
See, the let's look at the differences first, because that may help us understand this. The Holocaust, for all its horror, was undertaken by the European empires, the residues of the German Empire in the form of Nazi Germany, and the British Empire. Now, there are many, but being a part of a so called governmental decisions, files were kept, records were kept. The Holocaust was first trialed on the mentally ill, Operation K, as it was called, first exterminated all the mentally ill in the mental hospitals of Germany and in all the hospitals that the Germans conquered in Ukraine, Italy, France, etc. All the mentally ill people were summarily killed because they were the bigger taint on the gene pool of Germans than even the Jews were. To do this, they had to get the cooperation of psychiatrists, many of whom refused. Some of them did agree, and some of them were therefore investigated under the Nuremberg trials. Some were forgiven, a few were hanged. So the ideas of psychiatry, which extended from first defining who are the ones who are a burden to the state in the form of chronic mentally ill who need to be exterminated, then the ones who are mentally incompatible with the modern state, the Jews and the gypsies and the homosexuals and the trans and the dissolute. Sorry. So all these were done based on psychiatric theories. And these books and these texts and these journals exist. So one can critique them, one can understand them, and in the work of the Nuremberg trial and in the theoretical work of people like Hannah Arendt and Karl Jaspers, you see a kind of questioning of the very premises of Western civilization if this could occur. The partition, however, although our work and various other people's work also suggests that this was actually equally bureaucratically planned, was actually meticulously planned, that returning soldiers from the Second World War were trained to do the maximum harm in the shortest possible time. But all that was done in a so called spontaneous way. There are no records kept or they're not being made accessible. Many of the records of the British so called intelligence services, including Mountbatten's own records, are still locked in secret documents for the next 50 years. So we do not have the questioning based on files and data that the Holocaust allowed. The hospitals, the refugee hospitals that were set up to look at the injuries, we could find records till a few months as to how many fractures, how many stab wounds, how many knife injuries, how many slash injuries are there. But there are no names to any of that. It's only numbers. So you can't go back to the individuals. The medical records of Delhi have been completely destroyed, and there is no way to get back to the individuals who suffered through this. So the only way you can do this is through work like Urvashi Butalia, which is a kind of self-reported accounting of the terrors of partition. The 1947 archive, which is based in USA, trying to collect first-person accounts. Other organizations in both UK and India, which try to collect first-person accounts and memorialize it. The Holocaust investigations now extend not just from the experiential, but also to the biological. So there are epigenetic studies on the children of the Holocaust victims to see how much of this was inherited, what has been the subsequent transmission of this. 20 one of the things that brought me into this field was a paper I read in one of the psychotherapy journals, where somebody in Germany had done a very interesting experiment, or not experiment, intervention. They had brought together children of Holocaust, of the concentration camp guards, and children of the Holocaust victims, to see if they could forgive each other, if they could become friends. Now, when the perpetrators and the victims' children talk to each other, progress is possible. Now, whether in India we are willing to do these kinds of experiments in our civic life, that can we identify the perpetrators and the victims who may end up actually living next to each other even now, and then see what can be done to understand this process. And lastly, unless we actually draw a line between the points of similarity between these partitions, we end up seeing a partition as a unique concept which affected India. But you must remember that from the German Empire till the borders of India, the lines were redrawn with the First World War, with the Palestine, Israel, then with Iraq and Iran, then Afghanistan, and then, of course, the McMahon lines, the Durand line, and the Ratcliffe line. So these lines were very much part of the imperial colonial process, and we are not unique in that context, except that the violence was perhaps unprecedented as compared to anywhere else in the world. So to that extent, it is very difficult to understand the unique concept, because it has been made to appear, as the politicians pointed out, an act of madness. The first thing would be to disabuse people that it was not an act of madness. It was a rational violence, as malevolent as that of the Holocaust. Unless you accept that, a formal study of this cannot be taken. Madness is often used as an excuse, very convenient excuse.
Okay. Apologies, but Shagnik actually has a follow-up question
Sure.
to the one you just answered. In connection to the question of the Holocaust, can we say the same about the psychological impact of the persecutions in the USSR or in Eastern Europe circa 1945 to 1990, where records are vague at best?
Uh, I really wouldn't be able to answer that. I really wouldn't be able to answer that, because there, no, technically I won't be able to answer that, because the uh, the so-called communist bloc, the second world that we forgot now, we talk only of the first world and the third world. The second world had its own uh, political issues, and in the myth of the workers' revolution, ethnicity was supposed to be uh, an aberration. And but so the best example we get is of Yugoslavia, which persisted as a romantic ideal for 30, 40 years, and then rapidly degenerated into ethno nationalism very rapidly within 5 or 6 years. So the veneer of this romantic workers, you know, grassroots society uh, did not last very long. Now, whether it is an inherent fault of the communist system or it was engineered by more reactionary movements from the West, that comes into political science, and I'm not the right person to answer that. So I would not go into that space at all.
The next question is from Shourodeep Mukherjee, and it's actually a very interesting one. Has there been any cohort studies on any genetic or epigenetic changes on people
Sorry.
who have been through partition or their descendants? And if yes, does this show any inheritable traits?
We tried applying for a grant for this, not we, a group in IIT Kanpur who had access to uh, a small sample which was geographically very dense, very circumscribed in Kanpur, children of partition. But we were unable to get funding. There is a study which the government of India initiated in the 1950s itself, called the Lajpat Nagar cohort. Lajpat Nagar, if some of you have been to Delhi, Delhi is basically a refugee city. So Chittaranjan Park has refugee Bengalis, Lajpat Nagar has refugee Punjabis, Kohat Nagar has refugees from Jammu and Kashmir, from the village of from northwest Kohat, and so each part of Delhi, of the old New Delhi, which is Delhi's colonies which were set up in the 50s and 60s, were basically trying to recreate a sense of community in this partition in the new locations. So in Lajpat Nagar, they identified 10,000 children who were born between 1954 and 58 and kept records of their mothers' lives. And they are now following them up to their late age to see whether they have increased rates of diabetes, hypertension, chronic disease. They have not yet factored in genetics into it, but by the efforts of doctors at Safdarjung Hospital and the ICMR, about two-thirds of the sample is still available. So, but not many people are interested in it, and the sample, I think, is going through a natural attrition and decay. So, if you are interested, please get in touch with ICMR and ask for access to the Lajpat Nagar cohorts and see what happens. In Calcutta, the partition did not occur. The effects of the partition were not so sudden because even when I was a student, when I was young faculty at NIMHANS, what, 20 years ago, we would routinely get patients from the borders between India, Bangladesh, from Tripura, who would say their spouses work or their family works on the other side of the border. So the borders were completely fluid. And they were teachers, both Hindu and Muslim. They would have jobs here and families there or something like that. So the partition in the east is still a fluid, literally fluid process, because I think the rivers and the dams decide it rather than land. So you can't really partition a delta. So I guess it'll be a. So what I'm saying is that I don't know if there's a circumscribed population of partition migrants in Bengal in that sense, in that geographical sense that Delhi, Kanpur, and Bombay have had. But we have not had any genetic or epigenetic studies to the best of my knowledge. But it is feasible if there is a very interested researcher willing to spend 4 or 5 years of their PhD work collecting samples. It is feasible.
If you're all ready to take one more question, then I think
Sure,
we
sure,
will.
sure.
Sure. Okay. Shujata Chakraborty has a question that says, "What kind of psychological impact did partition have on the people of tribal groups such as the Chantals? Were there any emotional reactions?" And to that, I'm going to piggyback on a bit of another question, supplementary to it. As in, does the proximity to where the partition took place, the locations of partition, affect how intensely or how we remember the partition?
Right. So this obviously, can you leave the question on? Okay. So this is obviously quite an interesting issue. So when we looked at the records, unfortunately in London, of the kinds of violence that were being reported in 47, we found records of communal violence all the way in Bangalore and the border, what is now the border between Bangalore and Tamil Nadu. So this affected people all the way here. Shopkeepers in Shivaji Nagar and some parts of Bangalore insisted that they be kept as part of the British Empire because they did not enjoy the prospect of Hindu India. Armed police had to be called out. Now that is seldom mentioned in a history of Bangalore. That actually people were killed in the communal violence of 47 in Bangalore also. So the distance is quite an issue, and of course, many colleagues here uh, have this attitude that this is something that only you North Indians are worried about because it's not something that has affected us. But obviously, that's inaccurate because you can see Dr. Sastri from Indian Institute of Science has traveled all the way to Calcutta to participate in this meeting. So there was a concern. Even at NIMHANS, the first academic courses that were developed for psychology included lectures on group identity, group violence, the work of Le Bon, the work on mass hysteria. So they were trying to develop some kind of response to this violence, even in academic discourse. Now, to the tribal issue, there are two issues here. One, of course, is the real so-called tribals. Now, the tribal population in India, right from the first census or the second census of 1881, was defined by the British as being densely sane. They had much lower rates of insanity, and they were much more content with their life than otherwise. Gardner Murphy has a very interesting anecdote when he's doing these field surveys of India about the. Now he has this very simple thing of assessing communal violence, which is used even now by in various forms. Would you go to school with this person? Would you share a meal with this person? Would you be friends with this person? Would you allow your son, daughter to marry a person of this religion, etc., etc.? And you calculated a kind of metaphorical psychological distance of the other, and then you see how that affects day-to-day life. So this distancing of the other is still a commonly used anthropological tool. You can change community to madness or leprosy or TB or HIV, and the same questions apply. Would you allow your friend to play with somebody whose parent had HIV, etc., etc.? So the basic premise remains the same. So they're asking this from a tribal somewhere in central India, and he answers all the questions very politely, and he asks them, uh, "Would you like to ask me anything?" And the tribal says, "No." He says, "Do you wonder where I'm from?" Because Gardner Murphy is white American, and he's being assisted by Parsuram and various people all over India. He's hosted by the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. He says, "To the best of my knowledge, I think you've come from beyond the second hill, which I can see. And beyond that, it really doesn't matter. You're not part of my space in any case." So that was the notion of the world and the other in certain tribal villages. On the other hand, when Mr. Mandal was appointed as a minister in Pakistan at independence in the first cabinet, and he urged the depressed classes not to migrate because the depressed classes had nothing to fear from either the Hindu or the Muslim, because these were, as he said, completely upper caste fantasies, and none of our lives will change. So he saw no reason uh, for the other castes to get affected by this. His point was that it was completely a fantasy, vanity of the upper caste politicians to have engendered this partition. However, things on the ground did not obey that. And with the rising violence, lots of the so-called sweepers, etc., migrated. At which point, the government of India sent a request to the government of Pakistan, sent a request to India to set out a formal statement requesting people of certain caste to stay back in Pakistan, because otherwise, who would clean the toilets of the newly independent nation? So these issues, because there was no sanitation those days, it was still manual scavenging, and Mahatma Gandhi and the government of India actually put out a formal request to the scheduled castes, asking them not to move because otherwise the new citizens of Pakistan would be placed in distress. So these are the issues which have very seldom been understood or addressed now. And because we have been so preoccupied with the political machinations of the elite, that the subaltern experience of the partition has not been studied, whether it is of the mentally ill or of the very poor or of the marginalized groups. That has simply not been done. Most of the partition studies have been of the middle class and the rather parasitic uh, political elite, who keep showing that, I did this and I negotiated with this and that, which is not very interesting from a psychiatric or a medical point of view. I hope I've been able to answer your lecture, but that is something that comes up more and more. This comes up. For example, I'll tell you. I can give you a small example from real life here. So there's a landless road construction worker, or as you know, most of them are tribal populations who lived on a road, and because they lived on a road, they have no Aadhaar card, they have no home. Okay, and therefore a child was not able to go to school. And then the road was to be widened, and they were moved into an interior road, which was far away from a school, and which was definitely inside the state of Tamil Nadu. This lady was born in Karnataka. Her father was Kannadiga, but they belonged to a tribal group which exists across the borders. So husband was Tamil. Now, had a residence in Tamil Nadu. They were all part of one tribal population. The state of Tamil Nadu would not give her a card because she's born in Karnataka. The state of Karnataka would not give her a card because the husband is Tamilian. The child would not get admission to school because the government schools of either side would not do this. So the lady had the most obvious response. She became a goddess in a hysterical fit, and everybody obeyed. So she developed a dissociative episode, had some marama or something come into her, and she ordered all this to be done, and everybody did that. So sometimes this loss of identity can only be addressed by this kind of retreat into fantasy. So the moment this lady became a goddess, all these rules were quietly abandoned, and she got her child admitted to school. But these borders can really make life miserable for us. For example, now to get healthcare, you need a BPL card. And for example, in Bangalore, can you imagine poor patient comes all the way from Bengal, and they say we need the original, and he has to go back and get it. They will not accept any other version. So poor people cannot access healthcare based entirely on these partitioned state boundaries. So it's not just India, Pakistan. We are partitioning ourselves into smaller and smaller pieces. And that is really a danger. When a patient, most of the workers here in Bangalore, for example, all the people who work on the metro and all the other labor are from Bihar, Orissa, Bengal. But they cannot access the government hospitals because they're not local. Their companies are supposed to provide them worker insurance. No company does. And they can't access healthcare because they are not ours, but they are them. So us and them sneaks into every interaction of the citizen to the state, and that is a problem. The issue about the transfer of patients that Alok and I started out working with, that what was the notion of a state? Let me put it in context. Now, for whatever be the problems in, I'm talking purely from a psychiatric perspective, the Anglo-Saxon psychiatry of UK and USA, within the confines of its own cultural space, did not systematically kill the mentally ill. except, of course, the Tuskegee experiments and things like that. But there was no systematic extermination of the mentally ill, unlike the German Nazi Empire did, or the Japanese Empire did. The Japanese killed everybody in Rangoon, a mental hospital, when they came in. Now, so there were a very elaborate process on how to protect the mentally ill when civic unrest happens. And Alok, if you ever invite him, can give you a talk on how evacuations were planned. If in moments of crisis, the mentally handicapped, the disabled, and the mentally ill have to be protected and withdrawn. And this has to be done irrespective of who they are. And that was the basis of all our hospitals. Now, if you were building a new country, if you could not ensure treatment to the most disabled and to the most ill, how would it matter whether 400 people, Muslim patients, were in the independent country of India and sharing the same dal, chawal, roti as the other 100 crore people? Would 400 people really have been such a financial distress that we had to exchange 400 people with 400 people? Why couldn't we look after 400 mentally ill Muslim patients? Pakistan didn't because they were a theocratic state. But why did we have to transfer 400 Muslim patients? Why could we not ensure that we will look after people irrespective of their religion? And if you could not define that as a basic property of an independent modern nation state, then what kind of nation state were you building that you could not ensure medical help for the most disadvantaged? So that is the fundamental question that we have to answer. Why do we make health, education dependent upon identity? Why do we let, after all, as you would have realized, I work in genetics. When you work on genetics, you realize that that all the structures that we have of divisions between human beings are absurd because there is no genetic difference. Full stop. So why are we creating these kinds of differences when science and technology and medicine is assuring you that there is no difference? So it's that kind of perspective which we need to really wonder about. I'm sorry I've taken a bit long, but it's something that I think needs a little bit of defending.
And that was a wonderful note to end on. It's absolutely beautiful. And I think that's something we need to remember moving ahead in contemporary India with everything that's happening. Not going to
Yes.
go further into that. Uh,
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. It was absolutely amazing. I cannot explain how good it was.
Just
And
one, I'd like to dedicate this to the memory of my friend Saurabh Ghosh, who was a professor and dean of the Indian Statistical Institute, who passed away a few days ago. He was a close friend, intimate friend, and he had helped me for the last 25 years in almost all our work. And I've been to the ISI and NIMHANS often enough because of that. So it really is a dedication to him. Thank you very much. He was, I think, earlier in, yeah, whatever. There are lots of connections between Jadavpur and other people there. So thank you.
thank you so much, Dr. Jain. And with that, I think today's lecture session comes to an end. Just to note, Dr. Jain, you happen to be Voyager's 75th lecture
Oh,
ever organized.
wow.
So
Okay.
in this
Okay.
75th year of India's independence, I
Sure.
guess that
Sure. Sure.
all
Thank
the
you.
more
That's a nice randomness. Right.
little coincidences.
Right. But do send me a mailing list. Put me on your mailing list so that I can join in sometimes whenever I have the
Sure,
time.
perfect,
Okay.
absolutely. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you so much for inviting
So,
me, and thank you the audience for a patient, though delayed listening. Thank you.
make it everyone. Mandatory plug in, like, share, subscribe, follow. And we
Right.
shall see you another day with
Thank
another
you.
lecture.
Thank you. Thank you.